would grab your Bibles, go ahead and be opening up to the book of Hebrews. And we're going to be looking at the 8th chapter today, Hebrews chapter 8. So do appreciate y'all being here so much. And I put the PowerPoint back on the screen. We had it at the beginning, and I finally got it to start working again. So this is going to be covering what we've covered to this point. We've already gone through chapters 1, and we've made it through chapter 8, verse number 5. We got about halfway through chapter 8 last week. And so we're going to kind of look at this because we're changing sections, and we're kind of changing topics as we move into chapter 8 and kind of become dedicated into that. And so if you want to just skim through that real quick and kind of look at what we have covered to this point, remember we started off, and really the biggest chunk of the book is dealing with the superiority of Christ, why Christ is better. And now we're going to be moving more into the new law being better. And obviously that's still a result of Christ being better. And so we spent 8 chapters at this point in comparing him and looking at all the different ways that he is a better leader compared to what has been. We started off and talked about how he was better than the prophets. The first 3 verses of the first chapter introduced us to him and why he is better than the prophets. And then we talked about him. And there's a lot of comparisons made between him and angels. And so we talked about him being better than the angels. And then moving down there into being better than Moses through chapters 3 and 4, which pointed us to him being the great high priest as we got into chapter 4 onward, especially there into chapter 6. And so as we looked and we stopped at the end of last week, we kind of made the conclusion at this point. If you look in chapter 8, the first 5 verses of that, we were talking about why Christ is better. And we moved into this idea of the New Testament being better than the Old. And so whenever we begin to look at this, understand that everything we have talked about to this point have led us to this conclusion. Why do we not follow the Old Testament? Why do we not follow the Old Testament priesthood? Because those things have been done away with. Now we are looking at Christ as our great high priest. Now we are looking at the New Testament. And so this answers another question for us of what exactly are we supposed to follow today? Are we following along in the Old Testament? Are we following the Old Testament priesthood? And the answer we found is a resounding no. In fact, we are moving past those things. Those things have been done away with. And so as we look into this next portion and get onto this, we're now looking at why the covenant is better, the New Testament. So covenant and testament, remember those two things being similar. So whenever you talk about the new covenant, just know we're talking about the New Testament. So we're going to go ahead and be looking at chapter 8 today, beginning in verse number 6. And it's this very small chapter in comparison to a lot of the things we've been covering. But understand the ramifications of what we are about to read and how important it is. So let's go ahead and just read verses 6 and following. And I think this kind of unwraps the whole point we've been looking at so far of looking at Christ and looking at why he is better. And now we look at this new covenant, the New Testament, why it is better. So let's start in verse 6. It says, "But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. When they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me from the least to the greatest. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. And that he saith a new covenant, he hath made the first old. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away." So stop at the end of verse number 13. So let's unpack this for a second, because this is a very big and very important chapter for us. And so Jesus, we know from the beginning of this chapter and then in chapter 7, he is now our great high priest. Now, is Jesus better than Aaron? Yes. Is the priesthood of Jesus better than the priesthood of old? It is. And remember we talked about in chapter 7 and then a little bit into chapter 8 of why that is the case, because he is eternal, because he did not sin. And so we see the transitioning of that old covenant away from that and that old priesthood now to the new. And as we're looking at that, now consider what else is coming into place. And so in verse number 6, read the transition there that's happening and read what takes place. Now you've obtained, this is talking about Jesus, a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. So let's kind of think about that for just a second. So the New Testament, can we say it is better than the Old? We absolutely can. As a matter of fact, we must say that, because as verse number 6 says, it is a better covenant. Now, whenever you think back, why is it a better covenant according to verse number 6? First reason it gives us. What's it established on? Very end of verse number 6. Better promises. So it's a better covenant because it is established upon better promises. And so we talked about this back in chapter 6. And so mark your thumb there in chapter 8 and go back for just a second into chapter 6. And as you remember reading back here in verses 13 and following, this was talking about the oath that God made to Abraham and the things that we can rely on as far as God not changing, and whenever we understand that God also cannot lie. He's talking about this covenant being placed to Abraham and these promises that he had made. So Moses' covenant promised that Israel would have a land to be their home. But was this covenant contingent upon them staying faithful? Now go back and read in chapter 6 and following. And if you go back there in verse number 9, chapter 8, go back there and read verse number 9. Because chapter 6, he's establishing these promises that God makes. God's going to keep his promise. And so why does that promise go away? We say, well, okay, if God keeps his promises, then why does the Old Testament, why is it not in effect anymore? Because God promised them land. And he promised them a place to call home. But what does verse number 9 say? Who broke that covenant? Israel broke the covenant. And so today, can modern Jews say that God's promise for them, for the land promise, is still true? No, they cannot. That covenant is done away with. It is done. And we read that because of verse number 9, what it says, they were held to a standard that in order for this covenant to be true for them, that they were going to have to keep God's laws. Did that happen? No. A lot of times they slipped, and a lot of times God gave them the opportunity. The people of Israel are one that it's a very ugly cycle of remaining faithful for a very short period of time, and then kind of going back into this cycle of apostasy. And so while the covenant was good, and while it was still in effect, God giving them the opportunities, but he says there, they kept breaking it and breaking it and breaking it. And so now, according to verse number 6, now we have a better covenant that is coming based on better promises. You see, you and I, we don't have that promise there of a land, a physical land. It's based upon a better promise. It's based on something that's more lasting. It is a lot more important than this land promise that we see given to them. It is a heavenly promise. It's a spiritual promise. And so a lot of the times whenever we're looking today, and I see people that are, and I'm going to get into a political discussion here, and this is not the realm of necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about the support of modern-day Israel and stuff like that. We can have allies and support them, but just know that's not based on a biblical promise that today we have to support them because they are owed land. That covenant's done away with. It's done away with, and it's not in effect anymore. And so as you're reading there in chapter 8, you understand there that the modern Jews of today that still are looking towards that land, that's great. We can have them as allies, but just know the biblical promise in that covenant is done away with. It's not in effect any longer. And so we don't have to hold that in regard. Matter of fact, we're looking towards a better covenant. Now, I want you to go back for just a second and come to Galatians chapter 3 for just a moment. Galatians chapter 3, because Paul is talking about this very same thing. Galatians chapter 3. And if you go to verse number 19, Paul makes a statement here, and it's the same thing the Hebrew writer just told us back in chapter 8. But look at what he says there in Galatians chapter 3. Look in verse number 19. Galatians 3, verse number 19. He's talking about the old law. He's talking about the Old Testament. And so look what he says there. Wherefore then serveth the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. Now, according to verse number 19, the law was going to be good, but was it going to be forever? Or was it a temporary law? It was till the seed should come to whom the promise was made. The old law was in effect until that seed promise became fulfilled. And so the law of Moses, if you go back to verses 21 and 22 of Galatians chapter 3, it has a problem. And here's the problem that we have with the law of Moses if we are still under it today. Verses 21 and 22, Paul says in Galatians 3, is the law then against the promises of God? God forbid. For if there had been a law given which could have given life, verily righteousness should have been by the law. But the Scripture hath concluded all under sin, that the promise by faith of Jesus Christ might be given to them that believe. So through verse number 22, so the weakness is not in the law. What's the problem with the law? Why did it have to go away? Look at verse number 22 of Galatians 3. The law would be fine if none of us sinned. The law would still work if none of us sinned, but verse number 22 Galatians 3, Paul says the problem is that we have concluded all under sin. Romans 3:23 is what it says, and talking about the problem of sin. And so the problem was not that the law, the problem was people. And so the problem with that Old Testament is that it could never save in and of itself. It was always pushing ahead because it could never truly offer remission of sins. And it kept pushing and pushing and pushing it down the road. Now, is that to say that the people that are under the old law could not be saved? No, that's not what it says at all. Matter of fact, one of the interesting aspects about Christ's sacrifice is we talk about it going backwards to those people that kept the old law. But they still had to follow the old law. But without Christ, we cannot be saved. None of those people under the old law could be saved. And so we have a problem here. It was a problem in and of itself. Now go back, and here's a prophecy we'll read, because this is what the Hebrew writer is pulling from. Go to Jeremiah chapter 31. Jeremiah chapter 31. And at this point, as you get into Jeremiah, know that this is the kind of the last straw for God regarding the Jews and regarding especially their Judah and Benjamin, the two southernmost tribes. And Babylon is knocking on the door, and they're about to be taken over, and God has given them opportunity after opportunity to repent, and they have refused and refused and refused. And so if you go to Jeremiah chapter 31, look at verses 31 through 34. And this is what we read there and what we're talking about over here in Hebrews chapter 8. So Jeremiah chapter 31, beginning in verse 31, it says, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand, to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was an husband unto them, saith the Lord. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord, for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more, through verse number 34. So go back now to Hebrews chapter 8. Go back to Hebrews chapter 8. What he is quoting and what he is talking about at the end of that chapter is what we just read in Jeremiah 31. And this is all the way back there. The law of Moses is still in effect. And he's saying that there is going to come a time, there's going to come a day whenever that old covenant is done away with and a better covenant is made. And so this idea of using the new covenant. So all of a sudden, if something is new, what is the previous model? It is now old. You ever bought a new truck? It's only new for how long? Until the next model comes out, the next year. Now all of a sudden it's old. And so he's saying there, this new covenant is going to make the old one old. It's going to make it obsolete. And so if you look there in verse number 13, the very end of that, he's saying there, it has made the first old. And now what's ready to happen to it? It is ready to decay and vanish away. That's ready to absolutely get rid of it because of that better covenant at the death of Jesus. And so if someone asks us today, why do we not follow the Old Testament? Why are we not under the law of Moses? What is our answer to that? It's vanished away. It is done away with. We have a New Testament, a new covenant, a better mediator, and that's what Hebrews is all about, isn't it? It's all about how this is a better state to be in. Why would you ever want to follow the Old Testament law that could never allow you to be truly forgiven? Why would you ever want to go back? Now the kicker with all of this is, and this being said, is that God made this law for the Gentiles and He made it for the Jews as well. And that now today, both Jew and Gentile, they have to be saved on this new covenant and through the law of Christ. They can't go back to the Old Testament law. They can't follow that and be saved. Why? Because it's no longer in effect. Do you and I, whenever England was ruling over the United States and had their set of laws, do you and I follow that? No, because those things are done away with. That's what it would be like trying to do. It would be like trying to live in a country that generations have passed and laws have been done away with. We say, well, I'm still following that and it's okay. No, it's been done away with. You're not going to follow that and be a citizen. And so in the same way, we cannot be a Christian if we're following the Old Testament law. We'll never be saved there. And so all of this, just to point out the very simple fact that you and I have to understand, is that the Old Testament law is done away with. It's obsolete. It's vanished away. And now we are under a better covenant, a better testament, a better mediator. All of these things we're talking about Him being better. So any other thoughts through chapter 8, the end of that?
Chapter 13, who's He? That's He, God. God made it. He took it away.
Yes. No, and Tom brings out a good point there. If you go to chapter 13 and you're reading, and the reiteration of this is that God is the one that made it go away. This wasn't something there done by the whim of man. And that's also something there to point out too that Tom brings up, is that this is not an accidental switch. This is not a mistake. This is not a last minute change of them saying, well, Jesus is crucified, what are we going to do now? They've killed him. No, this was the plan all along, was to get rid of it. And I say that, so keep your Bibles marked there in Hebrews 8. As Tom brings that up, go back to Romans chapter 7. Because now the question that may be in our mind, we say, well, okay, if it's done away with, and the whole entire purpose of it was to lead to Christ, then why was it there in the first place? And that's a good question to ask. What purpose did the old law ever serve to begin with? Well, Romans chapter 7, and this is Paul stating this, and he's talking about why the Old Testament law and the New Testament law cannot be happening at the same time. So read verses 1 through 4 with me, and he's using the illustration there as a marriage covenant. And he's saying this is why both of these things cannot be happening at the same time. So Romans 7, beginning in verses 1 through 4, he says, Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then if, while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she can be married to another man. Wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that she should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. Now, if you stop at the end of verse number 4, the point that he is making is that they were concerned at this point about them following the old law and breaking that covenant. They're saying, well, if we follow the old law, then we cannot follow the new law. And his point to them is saying, and using the marriage illustration, he says, just like a marriage covenant. While you're married to that individual, if you go and you're married to somebody else, you're in adultery. But if that one passes away, it frees you to be married to another. And he's saying that the old law is what has passed away. It's no longer there. It's no longer in effect. And so, no, you're not in adultery by going to this new law. Matter of fact, you have the freedom to go to the new law. And that's the only way you have this freedom, is because it has been done away with. And so just keep reading there in verse number 7. In verse number 7, the same chapter of Romans chapter 7, it says, What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law, for I had not known lust, except the law had said, Thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, brought in me all manner of concupiscence, for without the law sin was dead. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life I found to be unto death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, and just, and good. Now, if we stop there for just a second, we ask the question then, okay, what then is the purpose of the old law? And Paul's saying this in verses 7 through 12. What is one of the purposes that it serves? Let's start with verse number 7. It defined sin. It defined sin. It said this is what sin is. And so in verse number 7, he's saying it was the law sin? No. If you read verse number 7, he says, I would not know what sin was except by the law. And so it did the purpose of describing to those that are under the law what sin is. He says, and he gives the example there at the end of verse number 7. He says, well, I wouldn't have known what lust is until the law of but thou shalt not covet. And so in verse number 8, he's talking about the law and the purpose it serves. He said that Old Testament, it has a purpose, and it had a purpose, and that was to make sure that they knew what sin was, and they knew what salvation was, but there is a problem with it, and that it could not save man. And so if you and I were under the old law, that's a scary thing to be under, because in and of itself, it cannot save us. And so what does Hebrews chapter 8 say? Okay, so the old law defines sin, but could not give you freedom from sin. And so what did we do? We look to this new law. And what are we talking about? This better law, this better covenant, this better mediator who is actually able to forgive. And so that was the problem there in verses 7 through 12 that he is describing. And so the problem with the old law and why anybody would want to be under it today is beyond me, because it's so inferior to the new law. The problem was it told you what sin was, but it also condemned you to that sin, because it did not offer you a way out. So that's a problem with it. So why would you and I want to be under that old dead law system? And once again, this is not to say that it was not purpose and that it did not serve a purpose. But the purpose it served is now old and done away with. Go ahead, Larry.
When we get a little farther over into Hebrews 8, we talk about the sacrifice of bulls and goats not being able to forgive sins.
Yes.
And so that's a comparison to the new law. As that went away, talking about the sacrifice of Christ. So
yes.
That whole situation was just, well, it was the whole law that had to go away, the whole situation.
The whole situation was, and it was a whole, and brings up a great excellent point there, Larry, talking about, it was also a shadow of what is to come. It also gives us an illustration there of those things that are about to happen and come into place. And all of these things we represent, we could study this for a year of just talking about all the things it represented. In a way, though, it's preparing people for Christ. And that's really the point of it. It's preparing people for Christ. It was never designed to last forever. It's never designed to last forever. And so there's one other place I want to look at before we leave this, because I think people get really confused on that and what the old law does and what the Old Testament does, and am I under it today? So one more place let's look at is in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. 2 Corinthians chapter 3. And here's another problem that the Jews are having at this point. And whenever you get over there, look about verse number 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, beginning in verse number 5. And so the Jews of this time, and I'll go out on a limb here and say, and since that time, for that matter, even today, struggle with this problem that they could not let go of the old law. They could not let go of the Mosaic law. So I want you to look here in verse number 5 and read on down with me, because this is what Paul is talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 of these same Jews of this time. They cannot let go of it. He says, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God, who also hath made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. And there's your comparison there in verse number 6. There's your comparison of what the Old Testament versus the New Testament does. That letter of the law, it kills, but the Spirit gives life, which is the New Testament. Now keep reading there, verse 7. He says, but if the ministration of death, written and engraven in the stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away, how shall not the ministration of the Spirit be rather glorious? For if the ministration of condemnation be glory, much more doth the ministration of righteousness exceeding glory. For even that which was made glorious hath no glory in this respect, by reason of the glory that excelleth. For if that which is done away was glorious, much more that which remaineth is glorious. Now just stop there at the end of verse number 11 for a second. And so they refused to see that the law had to be changed. And a matter of fact that it was changed. And so now read verses 12 and following. And he's saying that no, the old law, it has been done away with. It's already happened. So read there verse 12. He says, seeing then that we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech. And not as Moses, which put a veil over his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that which is abolished. But their minds were blinded. For until this day remaineth the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. But even unto this day, when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. Nevertheless, when it shall turn to the Lord, the veil shall be taken away. Now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. But we all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. Stopping through the end of verse number 18. And so God is giving them a better way. And he's saying, why would you continue to go back to that old law? And why would you go back to that old system? And in verse number 13, they're continuing to follow. He says, don't you realize that you were, the part of the problem is because of that veil. You're saying it still separates us. And he's saying, no, it's been done away with. So the question is, why would you keep going back to that thing that cannot save you? That's the question. Why would you ever want to go back to it? And so as you read through the end of the chapter there, verse number 18, the liberty and the ability to have freedom, you'll never find that in the Old Testament law. You won't find it. The only way we can have liberty and freedom is through Christ. So go back to Hebrews chapter 8, and I want to ask one question here before we move on. There's a statement made there in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse number 9. What exactly made the Old Testament weak? What was the problem that made it weak? According to Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 9. And I'll give you another little hint. In verses 18 and 19 of chapter 7, it talks about it being weakness and unprofitableness. So what exactly made it weak? What was the problem with it? That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And because of that, it could not save. That's exactly right. So the question in verse number 9 of that covenant, the problem with that covenant was not that the covenant was imperfect, but that man was, and man is. And so the weakness was not in the fact that the law was anything wrong with it. It was man. And so that leads us probably to the next question of, well, then what makes the new covenant different? Now look at verses 10 and 11 of Hebrews chapter 8. And this is a difficult verse, and let's kind of break it down because this is a difficult concept for us to sometimes think about. He says in verse 10 and 11 of Hebrews 8, "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall not teach every man his brother, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me from the least to the greatest." Now here's a thought for us all. According to the Old Testament system, you are born into the law. You're born into it, and before you grow up, you are made to be part of the law by what they would do there as far as the works are concerned, and circumcision, and basically making you part of the law. And then as you grow up, you are taught what that means. Can you today be an accidental Christian? Can we be a Christian and not know who Jesus is, and not know what he has done for sin, and not know who God is? No. So verse number 11, as he's talking about this, he's saying, no, you're not going to be a Christian and then be taught what salvation is. The only way you're going to be a Christian is if you know what those things are. If you know what salvation is, and if you know what that sacrifice is. And so it's a different law system that we're now under. We are not born Christians from birth. It's something there that we are converting our lives over to, and we have to know what the New Testament says in order to be Christians. You could be a Jew and be under the old law and not know the old law. And you could still be part of that number, and it'd be taught to you as you grow up. That's not the case today. And so verses 12 and 13, as we finish out that chapter, now we see in verse 12, here's something that could never happen according to the old law. And don't miss the importance of verse number 12. Without that verse and without this significance, you and I don't have any hope. We don't have any joy. He says, therefore, I will be merciful to their unrighteousness. The unrighteousness was the problem with the old law, though. The unrighteousness was the reason it could not be held. And he says, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. That only happens through one single way, and that is through Christ. And that is through his sacrifice. And so verse 13, finish it out, he says, that new covenant, because it is a new covenant, the first one is now old, and that Old Testament, guess what? It's ready to decay and vanish away. Now, to play here another question for you. Does that mean that you and I will have no benefit studying the Old Testament? No, that's not what he's saying. It's not what he means. But what he's saying is this, is that you and I will have no benefit if we follow the Old Testament law. It has every benefit because it is pointing us to this moment. It's pointing us and explaining to us all these things that happened, the history behind it. And through the Old Testament, we understand who Jesus is. Without that, we don't understand it. And so it is extremely fundamental and important. But are we under the law? No, we are not anymore. Any other thoughts through verse number 13? Okay, I want to take you, because we're out of time here, so I want to take you back to a couple places. I want you to go back to Isaiah chapter 43. Isaiah chapter 43. And ask another question whenever you get over here. So when you get there, look about verse number 25. So as you start going back and read a couple of events that are happening here. So go to Isaiah 43, then look at let's go back to verse number 22. Because Israel's got a problem at this point that they're struggling with. And Isaiah states this. He says, "But thou hast not called upon me, O Jacob, for thou hast been weary of me, O Israel. Thou hast not brought me the small cattle of thy burnt offerings, neither hast thou honored me with thy sacrifices. I have not caused thee to serve with an offering, nor wearied thee with incense. Thou hast bought me no sweet cane with money, neither hast thou filled with me the fat of thy sacrifices. But thou hast made me to serve with thy sins, thou hast wearied me with thine iniquities. I, even I, am he that blotteth out thy transgressions for mine own sake, and will not remember thy sins. Put me in remembrance, let us plead together. Declare thou that thou may be justified. Thy first father has sinned, and thy teachers have transgressed against me. Therefore I have profaned the princes of the sanctuary, and have given Jacob to the curse, and Israel to reproaches." So as you stop there at the end of verse number 28, Isaiah has explained to them the problem that they have is they're still saying that they're God's children, but they're not doing what it takes in order to be God's children. But he makes a statement there in verse number 25 that God is still the one that is able to blot out transgressions, that not remember sins. And so here's a question. Well, if he's saying that, if he's saying that back in Isaiah's day and age, well, could they then be forgiven of sin? So we're waiting off here, and this is why we need the waders and the mud boots, because this is getting into this topic. The only way these things could have happened is they're following the law. Go back now to chapter 9 of Hebrews. And I want to give us one thing, and Larry brought it up a moment ago. If you go to verse number 11, and we'll study through chapter 9 next week, but if you go to verse number 11, the problem here is what they are offering and the things that they are doing is good for temporary. And so it's ultimately rolling it over, rolling it over, rolling it over until Christ comes. And then it's going to be fulfilled. And so in verse number 11 of Hebrews 9, it says, "But Christ being come and high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of goats and cows, but by his own blood, he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. For if the blood of bulls and of goats and the ashes of an heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctifieth to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God?" Now, if you read verse number 19 and following, he's talking about how that was just going to simply continue to roll it over. And it's rolling it over and it's rolling it over. And ultimately, that's all it would ever do and all it ever could do was be that temporary sacrifice until the one that could come and make true atonement. And so the question is, well, could they be forgiven? Yes, they could be forgiven under the Old Covenant, but still only because Jesus came. because those things are only good for rolling it over. All right, so let's go ahead and stop here at the end of chapter 8. Now, I'll really encourage you to do a little bit of digging for next week, because chapter 9, now we're going to be talking about the sanctuary and the temple and the tabernacle. We're going to talk about a few of those things. So I've got a couple of things for you to be looking at this week. Look there in Leviticus chapter 16. And if you get a chance this week, read Leviticus 16 and then read Hebrews chapter 9. And this is going to be all the comparisons. So if you read Leviticus 16, you'll come to next week and have a pretty decent grasp of all these things it's talking about in Hebrews chapter 9. And so I would really encourage you to do that. Leviticus 16, read that whole chapter and break it down, because it's going to help us really understand what he's talking about in the tabernacle and what these instruments are and what these different things are and what they're doing. So we'll pick up next week, Hebrews chapter 9. Don't forget Leviticus chapter 16. And then we'll study